March 26, 1943. The coastline near Lae, New Guinea, shimmered under a brutal tropical sun. Australian infantry pushed through dense jungle growth, their boots sinking into coral sand, still wet from the morning tide. They were searching for Japanese stragglers, remnants of a garrison that had melted into the interior after Allied forces secured the beachhead. Then Private James Mitchell saw it. Something metallic, half buried in the shallows where the reef met deeper water. At first glance, it looked like unexploded ordnance, just another lethal souvenir the Japanese had left behind. But as Mitchell waded closer, he noticed details that didn't fit. A sleek, cylindrical body, precise engineering. A propeller at the rear, undamaged, its blades catching sunlight like polished silver. Not a dome. A torpedo. Japanese, judging by the markings etched along its casing. And completely intact. Mitchell radioed his commanding officer. Within 2 hours, engineers arrived from Port Moresby. Within 3 days, the torpedo was crated, loaded onto a transport aircraft, and beginning a journey that would take it across half the planet, Brisbane, then Pearl Harbor, then San Diego, and finally to the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. What those engineers would discover when they carefully disassembled this weapon over the next 6 weeks would expose secrets Japan had guarded for nearly a decade. It would revolutionize American submarine warfare, and it would turn Japan's most advanced torpedo, their silent death, their technological masterpiece, into the instrument of their own destruction. Because this wasn't just any torpedo. This was the Type 95, and its capture would change everything. When the Type 95 entered service in 1935, Western naval observers knew absolutely nothing about it. Japanese operational security wasn't just good, it was ironclad. The torpedo was tested in secret waters, manufactured in guarded facilities where workers signed contracts under threat of imprisonment, deployed with protocols so strict that submarine commanders faced court-martial for any action that might allow an intact example to fall into enemy hands. Its specifications read like something from a future that hadn't arrived yet. Maximum speed, 49 knots. Range, 5,500 yards. Warhead, 405 pounds of high explosive, enough to crack a destroyer's spine. And the propulsion system used pure oxygen instead of compressed air, a technology Western navies had experimented with and abandoned as catastrophically dangerous. The Japanese had mastered it. Submarine commanders in the Imperial Japanese Navy trained obsessively with the Type 95, firing practice runs in the inland sea against target sleds until they could calculate deflection angles without conscious thought. They learned to approach from vectors American doctrine considered impossible, to fire from depths that violated Western tactical assumptions, to vanish before counterattacks could even be organized. In fleet exercises during the late 1930s, the Type 95 achieved hit rates approaching 70% under ideal conditions. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself observed one demonstration. Witnesses reported him saying this weapon would make Japan's submarine force the most lethal in the world. The submariners believed him. They believed they held an unbeatable technological edge. Then December 7th, 1941, arrived, and belief collided with reality in ways nobody anticipated. The opening months of the Pacific War intoxicated Japan with victory. Pearl Harbor lay smoking. Singapore fell. The Philippines collapsed like a house built on sand. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with such speed that Western commanders struggled to process the scale of the disaster. But beneath the surface, literally, a different story was unfolding. Japanese submarines, deployed with such confidence and technological superiority, were struggling to achieve decisive results. American convoys proved harder to intercept than war games had predicted. American destroyers hunted with aggressive, almost reckless persistence. And American submarines, which Japanese intelligence had dismissed as obsolete and crudely built, began sinking Japanese merchant ships with alarming frequency. The problem wasn't the Type 95. The torpedo performed exactly as designed, fast, accurate, devastating when it hit. The problem was doctrine. Japanese submarines were repeatedly pulled from commerce raiding, their primary strategic purpose to serve as fleet scouts, supply runners to isolated garrisons, and evacuation vessels for stranded troops. They were magnificent weapons being misused as cargo haulers. And when they did engage enemy shipping, American tactics proved frustratingly effective. Convoys zigzagged erratically, making attack solutions nearly impossible to calculate. Escorts dropped depth charges with abandon at the slightest sonar contact. American merchant captains showed none of the paralysis Japanese planners had anticipated. Instead, they steered toward suspected submarine positions, forcing hasty crash dives and ruined targeting solutions. But something else was happening. Something Japanese commanders couldn't see from their conning towers. The Americans were learning. Every engagement generated intelligence. Every prisoner interrogation revealed fragments of procedure. Every piece of debris recovered from the ocean floor told a story. The Americans were building a comprehensive picture of Japanese capabilities, piece by methodical piece. And they were adapting with industrial ruthlessness that would have terrified Tokyo if anyone had understood the scale of it. Then came March 26, 1943, and a gift that would unravel everything. Quick question before we continue. Have you ever wondered how World War II navies actually reverse-engineered enemy technology? Drop a comment with your thoughts. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into naval intelligence and submarine warfare, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research, and your support keeps them coming. The torpedo that Private Mitchell found in those New Guinea shallows had been fired days earlier by a Japanese submarine hunting Allied shipping lanes. It had missed its target, failed to detonate, and wedged itself in coral shallows where the tide couldn't reclaim it. Pure chance. 1,000,000 to 1 accident. But accidents change wars. When the Type 95 arrived at Newport's Naval Torpedo Station, American engineers approached it like archaeologists uncovering a pharaoh's tomb. They had to understand why they needed this so desperately. The American Mark 14 torpedo was a catastrophe. It ran too deep, passing beneath targets without detonating. Its magnetic exploder fired prematurely or not at all. Its contact detonator crumpled on impact without triggering the warhead. American submarine commanders were firing geometrically perfect shots and watching their torpedoes pass uselessly beneath enemy hulls, bounce off steel plating, or explode halfway through their runs for reasons nobody could explain. Men were dying because their weapons didn't work. The Bureau of Ordnance denied problems existed. Submarine skippers filed reports with barely contained rage, describing perfect attack positions wasted by equipment failures. The Mark 14 was killing American submariners through incompetence masquerading as engineering. And now the enemy's best torpedo sat on a workbench in Newport, waiting to be understood. The disassembly took 6 weeks. Engineers worked rotating shifts, photographing every component before removal, measuring tolerances to thousandths of an inch, cataloging materials and alloys like botanists classifying an unknown species. The oxygen propulsion system, that marvel of Japanese engineering, was dissected with surgical precision. They discovered a pressure flask made of specially treated steel capable of holding oxygen at 2,900 pounds per square inch without rupturing. They found valves machined to tolerances American manufacturers had considered impossible for mass production. They uncovered a combustion chamber lined with a ceramic composite that could withstand temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Every element spoke of craftsmanship, of engineering excellence refined through years of iteration and testing. But they also found weaknesses. The depth control mechanism, despite its precision, had a systematic error. At ranges beyond 2,000 yards, the torpedo ran approximately 6 feet shallower than its set depth. Not catastrophic, but enough to cause misses against shallow draft targets. The guidance gyroscope, beautifully engineered, proved sensitive to electromagnetic interference from the submarine's own electrical systems if firing procedures weren't followed exactly. And the wakeless propulsion, while nearly invisible at cruising speed, left a faint phosphorescent trail at maximum velocity that trained observers could spot on calm nights. The Americans documented everything. They produced technical manuals, created training materials, distributed the intelligence to submarine commands across the Pacific. And they did something more significant. They used Japanese engineering principles to fix their own broken weapon. The Mark 14's depth control mechanism was redesigned using insights from the Type 95's simpler, more robust system. The problematic magnetic exploder was finally, after 2 years of denials and dead submariners, deactivated in favor of a contact detonator improved by studying the Type 95's reliable impact fuse. Testing protocols were revised to include the systematic analysis Japanese engineers had clearly employed. By late 1943, the Mark 14 was finally becoming lethal. Japanese submarine commanders hunting in those same Pacific waters noticed nothing had changed. They continued firing their Type 95 torpedoes with the same confidence, the same tactical approaches, the same doctrine that had worked in peacetime exercises. But American convoys were evading with uncanny timing. American escorts were predicting attack vectors with impossible accuracy. American submarines were striking Japanese shipping with devastating effectiveness, while Japanese boats struggled to find targets at all. There's a radio intercept from January 1944, decoded after the war, that captures the confusion perfect. A Japanese submarine commander reported firing 4 Type 95 torpedoes at what he described as a perfect firing solution against an American tanker. All 4 missed. He expressed genuine bafflement in his transmission. The sea was calm. The range was ideal. The deflection angle was calculated precisely according to doctrine. Yet the target had altered course seconds before impact, as if warned by supernatural intuition. He didn't know American codebreakers were reading his traffic in real time. He didn't know the convoy commander had been trained on evasion techniques, derived directly from captured Japanese torpedo performance data. He didn't know his best weapon had betrayed him by being captured intact. By mid-1944, the strategic situation had reversed completely. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships at a rate approaching 1 per day. Oil tankers from the East Indies, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine, vanished beneath the waves. Troop transports never reached their destinations. Supply convoys to isolated garrisons simply disappeared into the vast Pacific. The Japanese merchant fleet, which began the war with 6 million tons of shipping, had been reduced to fragments barely sufficient to sustain the home islands. And Japanese submarines, which had started the war with such technological confidence, had sunk barely 200,000 tons of American shipping, total across 3 years of combat. The psychological impact on Japanese submariners was devastating. They had trained for years with a weapon they believed to be superior. They had been taught that American submarines were inferior in every measurable category. Yet they were being hunted to extinction while achieving almost nothing. In interrogations conducted after the war, captured Japanese submarine officers spoke with bewilderment about the reversal. They had done everything correctly. Their torpedoes worked as designed. Their tactics were sound. Yet somehow, inexplicably, the Americans had learned to counter every advantage. One former commander, interviewed by American naval historians in 1946, described the growing sense of futility that had infected the submarine service. "We began to feel we were fighting ghosts," he said, "that the Americans knew our intentions before we ourselves did." He spoke of firing textbook-perfect torpedo spreads and watching targets evade at the last possible moment. He described the frustration of hunting for weeks without finding vulnerable targets, while radio intercepts reported American submarines sinking Japanese ships almost daily. When the interviewer asked if he'd suspected intelligence compromise, the commander shook his head. The possibility had seemed impossible. Japanese communication security was absolute. Their weapons were superior. The failure, he had assumed, must be spiritual. A lack of fighting spirit, a deficiency in Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan. He hadn't known the failure was systematic, that American intelligence and engineering had simply outpaced Japanese doctrine and security through institutional learning. The Type 95 torpedo was eventually superseded by newer models, but by then it didn't matter. Japan's submarine force had been marginalized by attrition, fuel shortages, and doctrinal failures that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome. The submarines that remained were increasingly relegated to supply runs, evacuating garrisons from doomed islands, one-way kamikaze missions. The weapon that was supposed to dominate the Pacific had become strategically irrelevant, not through mechanical failure, but through obsolescence created by enemy adaptation. There's a museum today at the Naval Undersea Museum in Keyport, Washington, where a recovered Type 95 torpedo rests in a climate-controlled display case. The placard describes its technical specifications, its oxygen propulsion system, its role in the Pacific War. Visitors, mostly elderly men with submarine service pins on their jackets, stop and study it. Some take photographs. The torpedo looks pristine, almost new, its dark green paint unmarked by rust or corrosion. It doesn't look like a relic of defeat. It looks like what it was, a superbly engineered weapon rendered obsolete not by superior technology, but by superior systems of learning and adaptation. The lesson of the Type 95 isn't really about torpedoes at all. It's about the nature of technological advantage in warfare. Japan invested years and enormous resources developing a weapon that was, by every objective measure, excellent. But excellence in isolation is never enough. The Type 95's superiority lasted only as long as its secrets remained secret. The moment one intact example fell into enemy hands, that advantage evaporated almost overnight. The Americans didn't need to build a better torpedo from scratch. They only needed to understand the existing one, exploit its weaknesses, and neutralize its strengths through doctrine and training. This pattern repeated throughout the Pacific War. Japanese aircraft, superbly maneuverable but lightly armored, were mastered once American pilots learned to avoid dogfighting and exploit superior speed and firepower. Japanese naval codes, carefully constructed, became transparent once American cryptanalysts captured codebooks. Japanese defensive positions, brilliantly engineered, were overcome by American industrial firepower and systematic siege tactics. Again and again, Japanese excellence in individual domains was overwhelmed by American excellence in systems. Systems of intelligence, systems of production, systems of adaptation, and organizational learning. The Type 95 torpedo became Japan's unintended gift to America. Not because the Japanese intended it, but because they failed to imagine the consequences of a single loss. They built weapons as if perfection could substitute for resilience, as if secrecy could endure forever, as if the enemy would never learn. They were catastrophically wrong. After the war, Rear Admiral Kani Kishimoto, one of the Type 95's principal designers, wrote a technical memoir about the torpedo's development. It's a detailed, precise document filled with engineering diagrams and performance data. But near the end, there's a passage where Kishimoto reflects on the weapon's ultimate strategic impact. He writes that they had solved every technical problem they'd set out to solve, that the Type 95 performed exactly as intended, and that its failure was not a failure of engineering, but a failure of imagination. They hadn't imagined that one torpedo, lost in a skirmish they didn't even know had occurred, could unravel years of careful development. They hadn't built redundancy into their security. They'd assumed their advantage was permanent. He concludes with a sentence that translates awkwardly from Japanese, but the meaning cuts through clearly. We built a perfect sword, but did not consider that the enemy might learn to forge steel. And so the Type 95, Japan's silent death, became instead a silent teacher. It taught American engineers how to build better torpedoes. It taught American tacticians how to evade Japanese attacks. It taught American submariners where to strike and how to hunt. It was a gift wrapped in tragedy, purchased with the lives of Japanese sailors who never knew their best weapon had been compromised, delivered to an enemy who transformed that generosity into annihilation. The Pacific War was decided by many factors: industrial capacity, strategic resources, leadership, code-breaking, logistics. But beneath the surface, in the dark, cold depths where submarines hunted and died, it was decided by something simpler: the willingness to learn from the enemy's excellence, and the systems to turn that learning into lethal advantage. The Type 95 torpedo still rests in museums today, perfect and defeated, a monument to the paradox that excellence without adaptability is just another path to obsolescence. And the lesson echoes still in every weapon developed, every secret guarded, every technological edge pursued in modern warfare. Mastery is temporary, but learning is forever. If this story grabbed you the way it did me during research, hit that like button and subscribe. There are countless untold stories from World War II that deserve remembering, and I'm bringing you a new one every week. Should I cover more submarine warfare next, or head to a different theater? Drop your vote in the comments below.